Sorry about that. Well, good morning. I would like to note that yesterday was Dusty and Jordan's anniversary, so let's give them a big round of applause for that. I would be remiss if I'm talking about anniversaries and did not also note that Tuesday will be Mary Beth and I's 8-year anniversary, and she would call that 8 long years. I also have a note, as we're kind of talking about personal things. I have a note from Lee Jackson I just want to read before we jump into things. He writes, I just want to say thank you all so much for the cards that you sent during the loss of my father and my brother-in-law. I love you all very much. This family has always been here for us. My sister said she knows that we are in the right place here because of the cards and the love you have sent her. She said that you are doing God's work, and to thank you all. So thank you, Lee, for sharing that. We love you. We love you lots. We are actually entering into our time for the sermon. We are beginning a series on the Lord's Prayer, and it's going to take us all the way through the end of this fall semester. And I want to kind of note two things before we jump into things with this sermon, and why we're kind of first thing is why we're kind of structuring it this way with the sermon coming first, right? The Lord's Prayer. In the Lord's Prayer, one of the things we're going to look at, the main thing we'll look at today, is the way that Jesus is actually revealing to us who God really is in the Lord's Prayer. And so in this series, the reason we kind of want to flip things on its head and have the sermon before everything else that we're doing is because in this series, we want God to speak to us before we speak to him or each other. Right? We want God to reveal to us who he truly is, and then we want to sing, and we want to take communion, and we want to do all the other things that we do in worship in response to the revelation of who God is in the Lord's Prayer. So that's kind of why we're structuring it this way. The other thing I want to note about this series is that it is unapologetically geared towards younger people. All right, and I'm saying that unapologetically. I know we're a little bit older of a congregation, but if you've heard us talk about Deuteronomy 6, right, is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and your strength, and then what? Impress it on your children. In other words, this thing that's supposed to be the orienting force in your life, your faith in God, your faith in Yahweh, you're supposed to pass it down to the next generation. And so whether you're a young person, if you're a young person, I think you'll find this extraordinarily relevant to you. But if you're not a young person, you either have grandkids or kids or nieces or children in this church that you care about and you care about deeply, right? And it's still our responsibility, the older generation, to pass on our faith to the younger generation. So this series is unapologetically a Deuteronomy 6 kind of series. It is focused on our youth. With that said, I do think, adults, there will be a lot for you to reap from this series. Before we really jump into our sermon for today, let me take care of a couple housekeeping things. First is... Obviously, we're on fall break, so I think a lot of our high school students are out of town and our high school families are out of town. So the youth won't be meeting tonight. The college group will be meeting tonight. However, that is going to start happening an hour before it used to. So it used to start at 6:30. That'll now start at 5:30 in the fellowship hall. So get excited for a fun home-cooked meal from, I think, Vicki and Alan Moore. So that if you're a college student, be here for that, 5:30 tonight. Also, I just want to make two notes about a couple things that are headed our way on Sunday nights that are kind of offered to the whole church. The first is on October 27th, Sunday, October 27th. We will be having a pumpkin carving. That'll run from 4 to 6 p.m. If everyone's invited, we understand that's more geared towards kids. But if you want to watch kids carve pumpkins, or if you want to be an inner kid yourself and carve a pumpkin, come and join us in on that. And then also on 11/3, so Sunday 11/3, we are going to have a whole church gathering because we're very excited to say that Chi is going to be here, and she's going to make a presentation on right steps for our whole church. And we're so excited about that. I know I'm very excited to finally meet Chi. I've heard so much about her from Anita and others, and just very excited about hearing more about what God is doing through Right Steps from her. And so that'll start at 5:30. There will be dinner, and then at 6, she will give us a presentation. So we're really excited about that. Also, before we jump in, I would be just absolutely remiss to not know, Dennis, it's really good to see you. We're really glad you're back and out of the hospital. So thanks for being here. Let's give Dennis a thank you. Well, as we jump in, a sermon a good sermon, some would say, would usually walk you through a text, and then the preacher would ask the question, so what, right? What does this mean for your life? And so the sermon would kind of be like theology and then application. However, this morning, because I'm not a good preacher, I want to begin with application and then spend the rest of the sermon justifying why I think you should do what I'm telling you to do from the very outset of this sermon. So here's the application for today. You can pack your books and go home after this if you want. Here's what I want us to do. Individually, I want you to begin to pray the Lord's Prayer once a day, right when you wake up, or maybe right when you go to bed, maybe right before lunch or before dinner. I don't care when it is, but I do want you for at least the next week to pray the Lord's Prayer once a day. Just pick a time and stick with it, okay? So on an individual level, I want you to start praying the Lord's Prayer once a day. At least, my hope is that you'll do it for the rest of this month. That through the rest of October, you'll pray the Lord's Prayer once a day. And by the way, guess what? Each week, we take care of that at least one of the days of the week, and that is Sunday. So that is my communal point. My hope is that you'll keep coming back on Sunday, all right? That is the other thing. This is the easiest application you'll ever hear from a sermon. I want you to join us each Sunday for the rest of the fall semester to pray the Lord's Prayer together and immerse yourself in the stories that Jesus is inviting us into as we pray this prayer, and into the relationship with God Jesus is inviting us into through this prayer. Now, this may seem very mundane. It may seem very rote, right? Ben, you're telling me that the application of the sermon is simply to say the same words over and over and over again. And my answer is absolutely yes. Last week, I had the, I would say, pleasure of meeting Micah. However, it is not a pleasure to meet him. You're supposed to laugh at that. Did you like him? Micah's, yeah, no. But you did have the pleasure of meeting Micah. And one of the best pieces of advice is that Micah, who was my campus minister when I was a student, gave to me was this. He said, Christian spiritual formation is not about an ordinary commitment to extraordinary practices. Okay? So let me translate that. It is not about kind of half-heartedly doing these magical things that will radically transform our lives, all right? That's not what Christian spiritual formation is about. So Christian spiritual formation is not about an ordinary commitment to extraordinary practices, but rather it is about an extraordinary commitment to extraordinarily ordinary practices. Practices like saying the Lord's Prayer. I truly believe that if you commit yourself to praying the Lord's Prayer, you give yourself over to this practice, you immerse yourself in its stories each Sunday as we'll walk through it line by line, that it'll bring about a revolution of redemption in your relationship with God. I believe that if you commit to praying the Lord's Prayer once a day for the rest of this month, your life will be radically changed and changed for the good. It'll sharpen our worldview. It'll tether us to reality as it helps us grapple with and imagine who God is, how he's at work in this world, as well as our life within it, okay? I think if you pray the Lord's Prayer, by the way, we would all claim that the Christian claim would be that God is ultimate reality, right? That nothing is more real. He is the unmoved mover, right? It is through him all things were created, and all things will be sustained, and all things will be saved, right? Can I get amen to that? Yes? So, if God is ultimate reality, and we have a misconception of God, that means me and you, we are all living inside of a lie. And if we don't understand ultimate reality, that means we don't understand anything below that ultimate reality. So if we have a misconception of God, it drastically impacts our life, all right? And so this prayer is a way that Jesus is revealing to us who God is. And so praying this prayer radically will change the way you view God, and in so doing will radically change your life and change it for the good, because it's going to align you with ultimate truth. And that is, who is God, okay? So I really do think that an extraordinary commitment to this ordinary practice will change your life. And so this morning, what I want to do is I'm going to talk to you about two things. The first thing is, how does the Lord's Prayer revolutionize our view of the God that's revealed in the Bible, okay? How in the world is this prayer going to change the way we view about God? And this is a cards on the table moment. Here's what I think it's going to do. I think it's going to have you move from seeing God I think currently we see God as kind of far off, distant, remote, nothing kind of more or less than the man upstairs. And as you pray this prayer, I think what will happen is you will move from seeing God that way to begin to see him as present and active in your here and your now. A God who is not is yes transcendent, but is also immanent. A God who has manifested himself in the most mundane parts of our lives. So the second thing that I want us to talk about this morning is how does that paradigm shift change our lives? If you have a Bible with you, I encourage you to go ahead and turn to Matthew chapter 6. And also, if I can just be turned up a little bit, Ben, because I'm really straining. Yeah, I need to be up. If you have a Bible with you, turn to Matthew 6, and you'll see the Lord's Prayer there. It's kind of at the top of it, but a little bit down. And before we jump into kind of working through the prayer this morning, well, I want to kind of give you a context. So the Lord's Prayer comes in what famous sermon of Jesus? What famous sermon? Sermon on the Mount. So who is Jesus' original audience in the Sermon on the Mount? Who's Jesus' original audience? Disciples? Some Jews. Yeah, so first century Jews. Okay? And first century Jewish culture was an oral storytelling culture. And what we mean by this is that they would have sat around tables, they would have sat around campfires as we would envision it, and they would have told the stories of old. In other words, what we call the Old Testament. So all the VBS stories we did as children, they are just totally immersed. They didn't have TV. This is how they entertained themselves. They would have told the stories of God's great acts on Israel's behalf in the Old Testament. So think about it, right? This is the stories they would have known. Think about the story of Abraham, Abraham's calling, right? You have the Tower of Babel, and then God just plucks Abraham out of all the nations and says, through you I will bless all nations. And however, Abraham's descendants, they end up as slaves in the nation of Egypt, right? And then they would have been told the great stories of the Exodus narrative, including the Passover and the parting of the Red Sea, right? And the stories of the wilderness, how God provided manna for 40 years and quail for 40 years, right? They would have been told all of these stories. They would have told the stories of the conquest, how God fulfilled in the age, in the era of Joshua, all the promises that were made back to Abraham. So the stories of the conquest, these were stories that all these people would have known. They would have known the stories of David and Solomon and the building of the temple in 1 Kings chapter 8, when the temple is finally built and the glory of the Lord fills the temple and all the nations flood in and finally worship the one true living God of Israel. So they would have known all these miraculous stories, these ways that God had worked on Israel's behalf in the past, way back then, but they would have also known the stories of the exile, how the southern and northern tribes of Israel split into two nations, how the northern tribes of Israel were taken into captivity by the Assyrian Empire and then were lost to history, never to return. They would have known the stories of the Babylonian exile, in which the southern tribes who remained were then taken into exile and returned after 70 years. And then come the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah when they rebuilt the temple, but it wasn't like 1 Kings chapter 8 anymore. The glory of the Lord did not descend upon the temple, but rather, and the nations did not come in and flood and worship the one true living God, but rather Israel traded oppressor for oppressor for oppressor for the next 400 years. And Jesus comes onto the scene. You see, the context of the Sermon on the Mount, the context of the Lord's Prayer is 400 years, if you're a first century Jew, of seeming silence from God. The original audience would have been tempted to see God as someone who is far off, distant from their here and now, maybe aloof, not concerned with the mundane parts of their everyday lives. 400 years of seeming silence from God has an impact on how you view the world around you. And because God was seemingly silent, because they saw God as far off and distant and remote, what do? They put God on the back burner, and they turned to other things to look for their status and their sustenance and their salvation. They gave their allegiance away to other things. And there are three main postures towards this false belief that God was far off and distant and remote. The first comes in the people of the Sadducees. So the Sadducees were the people who kind of ran the temple. So things were going well for them. Who's oppressing Israel at the time that Jesus comes onto the scene? Who's oppressing Israel? The Roman Empire, right? And so the Sadducees, instead of looking upward to God, they turned outward to the Roman Empire. They said things are going well for us, so we'll compromise with the Roman Empire. We'll compromise our values, and they'll keep us in charge. All right, so that's what the Sadducees did. They looked outward. The Pharisees, on the other hand, said, okay, God is far off and distant and remote. We're going to put him on the back burner of our lives. So God is not involved in our here and now. That means it's all up to who? Me. It's all up to me. And so they turned inward on themselves. And they looked inward at themselves to be their source of status and sustenance and salvation. And the third main group is this group called the Essenes. They say God is far off, God is distant, God is remote. He's on the back burner. You know what? Because God is far off and distant and remote, the society is going to hell in a handbasket. Let's get out while we can. And they turned away from society in fear. And so these are the three main postures. And if you were, these are all kind of more higher up people, okay? These would have been the elites of the day. But if you're one of the kind of plebeians or you're one of the peasants of the day, you would have found yourself kind of, hey, which one of these elite parties am I going to align my life with? But here's the thing, all of them had the same view towards God. He's far off, he's distant, he's remote. 400 years of seeming silence from God, so he's on the back burner. And here's the thing. Even though our lives are extraordinarily different from first century Jews, I think we approach the Lord's Prayer with the same view of God that they did. He is far off, he is distant, he is remote, and therefore he sits on the back burner of our lives. He is nothing more or less than the man upstairs, and so what? We're going to keep him there, far away from our here and now, present mundane lives. My least favorite part of interning when I was a campus ministry apprentice was working orientation tables. So, right, you met Micah last week, who was my campus minister, and I worked for him for 2 years. And one of the things that we would do in the summer is we'd go table at orientations. And at Auburn, I did go to Auburn, and we didn't play yesterday, so we didn't lose, and that was a really good feeling. Laugh at my expense. But one of the things that we would do is the way that the campus ministries at Auburn related to each other, they had something called the Campus Ministry Association. And so the Campus Ministry Association would in and of itself have a table at orientations. And we would try to get students to fill out something called an RPC. Now, RPC is a euphemism. It stands for Religious Preference Card. And so what would happen is we would be at the way these orientations kind of involvement fairs worked is that we were all shoved, all the different organizations, we were kind of shoved to the bottom of the tallest building. We were in the basement of the tallest building on Auburn's campus. It was called the Haley Center, okay? We're all on the bottom, and students would kind of flood in after being sweaty from a long day of walking around Auburn's campus, learning new things, and they're freshmen, so they're just like, some are bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Some are just like done with it. They're over it at this point. But they all flood in, and we had the guy who was the Wesley Foundation. The guy who ran the Wesley Foundation. He was this big guy named John Weaver, and he'd jump out in front of all the freshmen to kind of catch them off guard, and he'd say, "Hey, welcome to Auburn. We'd like for you to fill out an RPC." Okay, and at that point, what question do the students ask us? What's an RPC? Okay, our guys is up. All right, we've hid it from them long enough, and then we have to answer the question. We would say, well, it's a religious preference card. And here's the thing. When that word religious came out of our mouths, we get one of three responses. The first response would be a response of interest, right? It's still Auburn. It's still the Bible Belt. There's plenty of students who would kind of perk up and they would be excited and, oh, hey, yeah, I'll fill this out. This is exciting, right? And they'd check off the box, I'm Church of Christ, I'm Methodist, I'm Baptist, whatever. And so they'd fill out the RPC gleefully, right? That happened. I mean, it was the Bible. That happened plenty. The second response we'd get is a look of absolute disdain or contempt, right? The look that would say, how dare you bring God up in front of me? But here's the thing. I want you to know that this is very important for you to understand. That response was extraordinarily rare. That rarely happened. Rather, the most common response was not a response of interest. It was not a response of anger. But by far the most common response when we would say the word religious was a response of not interest or anger, but rather indifference and complete and total apathy. The moment the word religious came out of our mouth, we became utterly irrelevant to every student we talked to. Why? Why is that the case? Because the God that they pictured was far off and distant and remote, and therefore was on the back burner of their lives. Each year, thousands, hear this, thousands of students will walk away from the Christian faith on the college campus. And yes, I'm willing to admit, I'm willing to cede to you, some intentionally and with a vendetta against religion, a vendetta against God. But most of them do so is because the God that they picture is so distant from and therefore inconsequential to their lives that they shed religion at the doorstep of their dorm room. In other words, hear this. It is not that students show up to campus and then lose their faith. That is not what happens on the UGA campus. That's not what happens on the Auburn campus. That's not what happens on the Ole Miss campus. That's not what happens. Rather, what happens is they show up to college campus with a faith that is so hollow and so void that when the pressures of campus press down on it, it cracks and it crumbles because it was already non-existent. How do I explain this? Mary Beth and I have moved in our life. From Auburn, we moved to Kentucky. From Kentucky, by the way, that's where we met Barrett Kaufman, for those of you who know Barrett. From Kentucky, we moved to Oklahoma. From Oklahoma, we moved to Mississippi. And then obviously, just recently, we moved from Mississippi to the great state of Georgia. And every time we moved, there was always a closet. And in this closet we had not opened in Mississippi for 5 years, there was what? Tons of unopened. Now, what do you think we do with those boxes? We get rid of them every time we moved. Why? Because they were far off, they were distant and remote from our lives, and so we just leave them. That's what happens with God every single fall on the college campus. God has been far off, God is distant, at least that's their perception of it. He's remote, and so what do? They say, he doesn't matter. And religion is shed at the doorstep of their dorm rooms. Now, here's the thing. That is obviously true of my generation, millennials. I believe that is true as I've ministered to Gen Z, which is the generation currently in college and entering into the workforce. I think that's true of them. However, here's the thing. Adults, you and I, we are not precluded from this. You see, the same research, by the way, what I'm talking to you about is something that was revealed in research called the National Study of Youth and Religion. It's by far the most extensive study that was ever done, sociological study ever done on a generation in religion, okay? And what they found was this idea that we're talking about, this idea that God is nothing more or less than the man upstairs, this idea that God is far off and distant and remote. There's a technical term for it. It's called deism, all right? It's called deism. Is that God is nothing more than like a divine watchmaker. So think about a watch, it's very intricate in its design. So God creates the world, it's very intricate. But what happens after the watchmaker sells the watch? Is he involved, yes or no? No, right? So God makes the world, it's very intricate in its design, and then he kind of leaves it to run on its own devices. Deism, that's what it is, okay? And all the research said that Americans are not theists. They aren't believe in the God in the Christian Bible, but rather they are deists. They believe in a God who is far off and distant and remote. And all the research that said our youth believe this, guess what they said? The sources for this belief. The parents. In other words, me and you, our churches and ourselves, our way we raised our kids, we pass this belief down to them. It isn't their fault, it's our fault. We haven't done a Deuteronomy 6 life, have we? We haven't loved the Lord our God with all our heart and our soul and our strength, and therefore we've not impressed it on our children. You see, just like students allow God to get crowded out as they enter into their college years, we fall into that pattern too. We go to church on Sunday, but each Monday we walk out back into the hectic frenzy of modern life. Taking your kids to school and practices of all sorts, tending to the house, paying your bills and your mortgage, which grows increasingly more difficult and increasingly consumes your mind, going to doctor's visits, finding your way in life, trying to make friends, traveling to see family as they disperse further and further away. And because the God we picture is so distant from all those seemingly mundane parts of our life, where does he end up? On the back burner, far off and distant and remote from our here and our now. And so, yes, we are very different from first century Jewish people. But when we hear Jesus say, this then is how you should pray, when he says, this then is how you should grapple with and view the God that's revealed in the Bible, when that happens, we have the same posture towards God that they did. We think he's far off. We think he's distant. We think he's remote. We think he's nothing more or less than the man upstairs. And so with that in mind, I want us this morning to walk through the Lord's Prayer, all right? And as we walk through the Lord's Prayer, what I want you to do is I want you to imagine, just for a minute, you're a first century Jew. And I want you to imagine that you have immense knowledge of the Old Testament, even if you don't, okay? Don't worry, that's what I'm going to unpack for you, okay? I want you to imagine how they would have heard these words that me and you have been praying every Sunday morning since I've showed up here, all right? So Jesus has this large crowd. He gathers his disciples. He begins teaching them. He begins with the Beatitudes, and then he proclaims to them, "You're salt and light," and then he talks about the law and the prophets, and then he goes on to all these moral teachings. And then we turn to chapter 6 of the Gospel of Matthew, and he starts talking about prayer. And then he says these words. He says, "This then is how you should pray. This then is what you should expect of the one true living God of Israel. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name." And immediately your mind is taken to the stories of the Exodus, probably specifically the passage that Walt and Jan read over us, Exodus chapter 4, verses 22 through 23, because those are that verse that they read over us. That is the first time in Israel's history that Israel's called God's son. This then said to Pharaoh, "This is what the Lord says. Israel is my firstborn son. I told you, let my son go. Why? So that they might worship me, so that they might hallow my name." This is the way one New Testament scholar puts it. Therefore, the very first words of the Lord's Prayer contain with it not just intimacy, but revolution. Not just familiarity. It isn't just like, "Oh, isn't this sweet? God's our Father. Oh, doesn't that make you feel safe?" No. It is not just familiarity, but rather it is a sense of immense hope. Think about it. You are a first century Jew, and who's oppressing you right now if you're a first century Jew? Rome. And before Rome, it was somebody else. And before it was somebody else, it was somebody else. You've been trading oppressor for more than 400 years. And the first words out of Jesus' mouth after saying, "This then is how you should pray," is, think of the Exodus. Think of the time when God brought about the liberation of his people in tangible and practical and palpable ways. God is not far off and distant and remote. He is the God, the Exodus, who parted the waters of the Red Sea. He's the God of the 10 plagues, the God of the Passover. All this is swarming through your mind. But Jesus is just trailing right on, and he says, "Your kingdom come, and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." And your mind lurches from the stories of the Exodus to the time of King David and Solomon, when God's rule and will were manifest in the kingdom of Israel, and all of God's promises were being brought about in Israel, the nation of Israel, in tangible and palpable and practical ways by God himself. Your mind would have probably moved to 1 Kings chapter 8, that story I referenced earlier, when finally, David wanted to build the temple, but God said, "No, it'll be your son, Solomon." And Solomon builds the temple, and they build this temple, and it's magnificent and opulent and beautiful. And it says the glory of the Lord descends upon the temple, and then all the nations come in, and they worship the one true living God of Israel. That's what your mind would have thought about, but then your mind also would have thought this. Yeah, but things don't feel that way anymore. You're inviting me to pray this, but there's a cognitive dissonance here, because you may be telling me this is the case, but it certainly doesn't feel to be the case. Nations don't flood to the temple to worship the one true living God. Nations oppress us. But then your mind would have turned to maybe the prophet Ezekiel in chapter 37, who wrote these words. "This is what the sovereign Lord says." Notice the word Lord, the King of the universe. "I will take the Israelites out of the nations where they have gone. I will gather them from all around, and I will bring them back to their own land. I will make them one nation in the land, on the mountains of Israel. They will be my people, and I will be their God. And my servant David will be king over them, and they will have one shepherd." Remember that the kingdoms have divided. They'll be brought back together. "They will follow my laws and be careful to keep all my decrees." And just as you're beginning to feel that cognitive dissonance and connect those dots, Jesus just steamrolls on, and he says, "Give us this day our daily bread." And with those words, you begin to have whiplash, because you're brought right back to the story of the book of Exodus. the 40 years that the Israelites spent in the wilderness in response to his people grumbling that they were better off in Egypt. Remember, they say in Exodus chapter 16, wouldn't it have been better that we died in Egypt where we sat around pots of meat? You have brought us out here to starve us to death. And what is God's response to this? For the next 40 years, he rains down manna from heaven every morning so that his people can eat their daily bread. It's a sign of God's present and active and proactive provision. And as your mind is thinking about that proactive provision from the one true living God, Jesus quickly then says, and forgive us our debts as we've also forgiven our debtors. And at this one, you're a little bit fuzzy. You don't exactly know what Old Testament story that Jesus is referencing. You're a little confused. But in your disorientation, it finally hits you. This is the year of Jubilee. This is Leviticus chapter 25. It's a law that was given to Israel by God, but that they never practiced. That's why it didn't come to you immediately. You've never experienced it. You see, built into Israel's calendar in the Old Testament was the forgiveness of all debts every 50 years. That's the year of Jubilee. By the way, when we sing, these are the days of Elijah, and we sing, the year of Jubilee, right? When we sing that song, that's what we're singing about. The forgiveness of all debts every 50 years. Twice a century, all debts were to be canceled, all land was to go back to its original owner, and all Israelite slaves who had indentured themselves due to poverty were supposed to be returned back to their land and freed. Now, I want you to imagine for a second, you're in the crowd, you're hearing the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus gets to the Lord's Prayer, and he gets to this line, but I want you to imagine you're a Sadducee. You are rich because you have compromised with Rome. You have made a bargain with Israel's oppressors, and you hear this, and you begin to feel the indictment of it all. What's your response? Who is this guy? We should crucify him. Do you see how Jesus gets into the trouble that he gets into? And as you begin, you're not a Sadducee anymore. You are a poor peasant. You've done nothing wrong with your life. You're perfect, okay? You can imagine yourself as that again. And as you begin to wrap your head around the implications of this line up behind me and the indictment of it all, Jesus closes with this one. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. This one comes to you immediately. This one you know well. Your mind is taken all the way back to the very beginning of Scripture, that after the fall, God says to Eve, your children will crush the head of the serpent. That all this sin and all this suffering that you face, your mind is swirling with all the sin and all the sin in your life, all the suffering that has been brought about upon you by Rome, all that's swirling in your mind, and you hear this line, and you remember God's promise from the very outset of Scripture that he will crush the head of the serpent. And you hope for a day once again in which God fulfills that great and wonderful promise. Imagine, right? You're standing there in the crowd as Jesus is kind of putting your mind through this Old Testament pinball machine. This God, this God, this God, this story, this story, this story. The God you picture in your life, 400 years of seeming silence from God. He is far off, he is distant, he is remote. He's the man upstairs, nothing more, but also nothing less. But this God that Jesus is inviting you to pray to is so very different from this God. You see, in the Lord's Prayer, what Jesus is trying to do, when he says this then is how you should pray, what he's trying to do is he's trying to create cognitive dissonance. He wants us to feel uncomfortable. He wants us to capture this reality that the God that me and you picture is not the God of reality. That the God that me and you picture is not the God that is revealed in Scripture. He's inviting us into a paradigm shift. You may see God this way, but he's actually this way. You may think he's far off and distant and remote, but I'm telling you he's present and active in your here and now, just like he was all throughout Israel's history. And it's not just a nice sentiment. It isn't just, oh, God's involved. You can write that on a Hallmark card. Isn't that nice? Isn't that quaint? Isn't that sweet? It isn't just that. Jesus is inviting us into a revolution in how we view God, not because it's a sweet sentiment, but because he actually thinks it'll change our lives. In other words, Jesus thinks theology matters. Jesus thinks that the way that you think about God has a trickle-down effect onto how you live your life. Think about, have you ever lived in a lie? Let's just take a very simple example. Have you ever gone through a drive-through and you didn't have your wallet? Okay, this happens to me quite a bit. I'm forgetful. I hate holding things in my pocket, and so I throw them everywhere. Some of you have even experienced having to bring, Ted Ford did this last week, experience having to bring me my stuff after church because I can't get up here preaching and flailing like I do with stuff in my pocket. I need to be flexible. And often I leave my wallet and I go through a drive-through and I make an order. That order is based on the assumption that I can pay for what I've ordered, right? I've lived in a lie. And then the lie hits. Now, that's a very simple thing, but remember what we talked about at the beginning. Is God ultimate reality? Yes or no? Is God ultimate reality? Yes. So think about this. If even a small lie that I'm living in affects my life, how much more if I misconceive of who God is, how much more would that affect my life? Would it not affect every last nook and cranny of my existence? If it is in whose image I'm made, if I do not understand in whose image I'm made, if I do not understand who created the world, if I do not understand who sustains the world, if I do not understand who saves the world, if I don't understand, would that not drastically impact my life? Theology, I'm not just saying this because I wear glasses and am a nerd. I'm saying this, theology matters. It's practical. See, our worldview, because we misconceive of who God is, because we don't think he's any more or less than the man upstairs, research has proved this out. Because of that, our worldview is distorted. We aren't tethered to reality. We aren't tethered to the truth of what is. And lies have begun to define our existence. And so as we close out this morning, I want to unpack for you 3 lies that the Lord's Prayer, praying the Lord's Prayer will help you combat, okay? That if you pray the Lord's Prayer each day for the rest of this month, if you come back for the rest of this semester, immerse yourselves in the story that the Lord's Prayer is inviting you into. That if you pray this prayer and you immerse yourself in these stories, that 3 lies that will combat, okay? And the 3 lies are this. The first is the lie of the sacred and secular divide. This is the lie that the Sadducees fell into. God is far off, he is distant, he is remote, he's aloof, and guess what? That means you get a compartmentalized God. I've told you all at this point the fact that I was a very picky eater, right? And so I don't like casseroles. I don't like my food touching. Because I don't like my food touching, what do I like? I love the school lunch tray. Right? I love the school lunch tray because there's a different compartment for you. You have your compartment where that square piece of pizza fits into perfectly. Then I have my milk compartment and it's even labeled for me. And then I have the 2 or 3 other compartments for my veggies, right? And the juice from the corn and the green beans don't flood into the pizza crust, right? Because we serve we serve green beans and corn with pizza, and school lunches, so none of the parts are touching. Here's the thing, as much as a picky eater as I am, and as much as I don't like casseroles, the truth of the matter is, our lives should look much more like casseroles than lunch trays. I hate cream of chicken soup, but right, in a casserole, what happens is you take all these food items, and then you combine them together, and then what do? You pour cream of chicken soup. And what does cream of chicken soup do in a casserole? It touches what? Christ is the cream of chicken soup, and he is supposed to touch every last nook and cranny of your life. And yet, me and you live lives that are much more like lunch trays in which we keep God separate and apart from everything else. God matters on Sunday, but on Monday, I go back to work. I jump back into my home life. I jump back into this or that. And God is far off. He is distant and remote. He's nothing more or less than the man upstairs, and I keep him up there because I'm in charge. This is the lie that the Sadducees fell into. God is far off and distant and remote, and so I will look outward to the world for my meaning and significance and sustenance and salvation. The second lie that I think praying the Lord's Prayer combats is the lie of self-sufficiency. This is the lie that the Pharisees fell into. God's far off and distant and remote, and therefore it's up to me. Think about the first sin. As Adam and Eve take of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, what are they doing? That is actually their declaration of independence from God. They're saying, we don't need you to tell us what is right and what is wrong. We will discern that from ourselves. Think about the lie the serpent told them. Remember here, the lie the serpent told them. You will be like God. And if you are like God, who do you no longer need? God. And by the way, nothing has changed. There's nothing new under the sun. We live in a day in which autonomy is seen as the highest of virtues. On the right, this manifests itself in rugged individualism, in which we pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. However, on the cultural left, it manifests itself in expressive individualism. By the way, that's what you see on the college campus, is it not? You go to college to discover who you are and learn all the different ways you can express that inner reality. But here's the thing, right? So think about college students. We picture college as the time in which students grow from being dependent upon their parents to being independent, right? That's the point of college. It's where they grow independence. However, as someone who cares about the spiritual lives of college students, we should not seek for college students to become independent in college. Rather, what we should seek is for them to move from being dependent upon their parents to being dependent upon the one true living God. Because here's the thing, students, no matter how much culture wants to tell us this, they are not more than enough. You and I, we are not more than enough. And when we buy into that, hear this lie, what does it lead to? Our death and our destruction and our decay. You are not more than enough. Only God is more than enough. So don't do it you can't do this on your own. And so we should be training college students, and we should be training teenagers, and we should be training our kids not to move from being dependent upon us to being independent. We should be training them to move from being dependent upon us as those who bear God's image to them. Okay, it's fine that they're dependent upon us when they're kids, to growing in dependence on God. Because it is only God who will never fail or forsake them. Why would we ever want to leave our children to their own devices? The third lie that I think praying the Lord's Prayer combats is the lie of fear. Whether it be our own sin, whether it be our suffering, whether it be fear of everything going on in society. It is so easy to be like the Essenes, and we say, the world's going to hell in a handbasket. I see myself going to hell in a handbasket. I'm going to cower away from the world in fear. But here's the thing. The God that's revealed in the Lord's Prayer, the God that's revealed all throughout Scripture, is a God who has not left the world to its own devices, and therefore we should fear the world, but rather is a God who is present and active right in the middle of the mundane parts of everyday life. God is not far off and distant and remote, and therefore we do not live with fear. You don't have to fear politics. You don't have to fear your own sin. You bite it, you fight it, you battle it, but you don't fear it. You don't have to fear suffering, because the ultimate reality is that Emmanuel, God is with us. And that is the great reality that we are now going to sing in response to, and take communion in response to, and give money in response to. All the things we're about to do now flow out of that great reality that God is with us. So in response to that, if you want to respond to this message, we're about to stand and sing. You can meet one of our elders in the back. You can come forward and I'll talk with you and we'll work something out. But let's stand and let's sing in response to these great